Verenkai, Vampire Island. Prologue. In the far north of Finland, where the sea mixed with dense fog and the sharp winds carried echoes of mystery, there was an island hidden from a human eye. Verenkai, the island of blood, was a place that legend described as being crossed by shadows and spectral light, a land of eternity, silence, and impenetrable night. No navigator ventured here without fear, and those who did returned with stories of shapes moving in the darkness, with eyes shining like rubies and a chill that did not come from the northern frost. On this island stood Kartano Varjoveri, the ancient palace of the Varjotar family, built by generations of vampires. Its Gothic architecture merged with the cliffs and dense forests, the high towers preserving the memory of hundreds of years, and the huge windows, decorated with gloomy stained glass, reflected the auroral light at night and the hidden courtyards and in the frozen gardens. Wild animals gathered, providing food for the vampire family without any human being ever touching them. The Varjotar family lived far from the eyes of the world. Taisto, the stern and imposing patriarch, supervised the island with ruthless discipline. Helmi, the gentle and attentive mother, watched over balance and harmony. Eero, Mikko, Sami, and Lori, the four boys, were taught from an early age to embrace the shadows and control their instincts. Eero, the only girl, was a mixture of curiosity and innocence, the light that pierced the darkness of the house. Verenkai had not known people for generations. The Varjotar family had only witnessed waves, wind, and wild animals. But the sea, like a living force, sometimes brought surprises. On a stormy night, lost ships from other seas could appear on the shore, and legends say that then impossible encounters began. Humans and vampires, two worlds that were not supposed to meet, but which were called by fate to share the same island. Verenkai was not just a place of shadows, it was a place of hidden beginnings, of choice and secrets. Under the Aurora Borealis and between the cold walls of the palace, a story was about to begin, about courage and fear, about friendship and love, about the meeting of two worlds that, for the first time, would learn from each other. And so, the island of Verenkai waited, silently, for its story to be told. Contents. Chapter 1. Verenkai Island. Chapter 2. The Palace of Shadows. Chapter 3. The Frozen Garden. Chapter 4. The Blood of Temptation. Chapter 5. Escape into the Forest. Chapter 6. The Embrace. Chapter 7. The Oath of the Night. Chapter 1. Verenkai Island. In the far north of Finland, beyond the fishing routes and the usual sailors' maps, there was an island that few could find and even fewer could understand. It was called Verenkai, an ancient name, spoken only in whispers by the northern winds, and the ancient language of the place. It meant the call of blood, but to those who lived there it had a deeper meaning. It was the place where night was not the absence of day, but the very breath of the earth. Verenkai was not a large island, but it seemed. Without its shores were laced with steep cliffs, carved by the sea into sharp shapes, like the fangs of a sleeping creature. The waves beat incessantly against the black granite walls, and the white foam rose like a cold side on the rare summer days. When the sun lingered for a long time in the sky, the light seemed foreign, almost indecent, over the wild relief. But at night, night was the true mistress of the island. Spruce and pine forests covered most of the land, and the trees grew so close together that light could barely penetrate between the branches. Thick moss covered the trunks and the ground, and the air smelled of resin, damp earth, and salt water. Here and there, small, deep lakes reflected the sky like black mirrors. On clear nights, the northern lights flowed over them in green and purple waves, like a heavenly river. The island lived, and breathed more deeply after sunset on the highest cliff. Watched over by tall firs and ancient stone statues, stood the palace Kartano Varjoveri, the mansion of the blood of shadows. Its walls were built of grey, almost black stone, brought from the heart of the island. The pointed towers pierced the sky, and the tall, narrow windows looked out to the sea like motionless eyes. Ivy climbed up to the balconies, and the massive iron gates bore engravings of wolves, bats, and ancient symbols forgotten by time. Inside, the air was cold but not lifeless. The long corridors were lit by heavy chandeliers, in which thick, steady flames of candles burned the dark. Wooden floors creaked sometimes, as if whispering stories from other centuries. The heavy velvet curtains fell to the floor, and in the great hall stood a long table of solid oak, polished by generations. The Varjotar family lived there. For generations they had not left the island. They had known no other lands, no other peoples, no other worlds. Verenkai was their universe, and the universe was enough. Taisto Varjotar, the father, was the central figure of the house. Tall, with silver-white hair and eyes so light blue they seemed almost transparent, he had a silent but commanding presence. Every move he made was measured, every glance weighed more than 1,000 words. He understood the island as others would understand a map. He knew where the fog gathered, where the deer hid, when the wolves changed territory. Helmi Varjotar, the mother, was grace incarnate. Her long hair, black as a raven's wings, fell in waves over her dark silk dresses. Her eyes, a deep green, reflected the light like emeralds hidden under water. She was the heart of the palace, the one who kept the harmony between her sons and who noticed the subtle changes in the air before anyone else. And then there was eye.No. eye.No Varjotar was the only daughter. She was not the strongest, nor the fastest, but she was the most attentive. She had a delicate, almost ethereal beauty, skin as pale as the moon, long, dark chestnut hair, and eyes of a grayish blue, like the sea before a storm. Unlike her brothers, who looked at the world with certainty, eye.No looked at her with questions. That night, she stood on one of the palace's high balconies. The wind gently moved her thin dress, and her fingers touched the cold stone railing. Below her, the sea stretched endlessly, dark, with silver reflections in the moonlight. Something was different. She couldn't say what it was, but she felt it. The air had a new weight, an almost imperceptible vibration. The night birds flew lower. The wolves in the forest had howled earlier than usual. Even the waves seemed to hit the shore with a changed rhythm. The island breathed differently. eye.No closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For vampires, the world was a collection of heightened senses, the smell of resin, the sound of a deer's footsteps hundreds of meters away, the vibration of the earth under the claws of a wolf. But now, among all these familiar sounds, there was an unfamiliar note, a thin thread of change, and the forest, wildlife followed its course. Deer crossed the narrow paths, and snowshoe hares slipped through the bushes. Owls watched from above, and somewhere, near the lake in the center, a bear searched for food. All these creatures represented the balance of the island and the food of the Varjotar family. Vampires did not destroy needlessly. They hunted rarely and precisely, preserving natural harmony. For them, the blood of animals was enough. Tea had always been that way. In the great hall, Taisto stood still, looking at the flame of a candle. Helmi entered quietly and stopped beside him. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly. Taisto tilted his head. Yes. They didn't need more words up on the balcony. Eero opened her eyes just as a faint light appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a reflection of the moon. It was a moving spark, almost invisible, like a flicker of fire carried by water. Her usually calm heart shuddered. It wasn't fear. Not it was anticipation. For the first time in her life, she felt that the island, her eternal home, was no longer an enclosed space, that the sea, which until then had been only a border, was becoming a road. Verenkai breathed deeper, faster, and somewhere, beyond the darkness, something was approaching. Before the clouds gathered over Verenkai Island, before the wind changed direction and the birds sought shelter, Taisto Varjotar felt the storm in his centuries-old bones. It wasn't just a presentiment. It was a deep vibration, a fine tremor that rose from the island's cliffs and ran through his body like a forgotten memory. He stood in the great hall of the Kartano Varjoveri palace, in front of the tall windows facing north. Outside, the sky was still clear, sprinkled with cold stars. The sea seemed calm, only slightly rippled by the night breeze. Any man would have said that the weather was calm. But Taisto knew better. He had lived long enough to learn that real storms do not begin in the sky, but in the depths. And the pressure of the and the silence of the forest, and the way the water changes its breath. He closed his eyes. The cold stone floor transmitted subtle vibrations. Somewhere, offshore, the sea changed its rhythm. The waves no longer flowed in a natural sequence, but gathered with a hidden intention. It was as if the ocean was breathing in more than usual, preparing to erupt. And the forest, the wolves no longer howled. Their silence was more unsettling than any cry. The door opened without a sound. Helmi entered the room, wearing a long, night-colored dress. Her dark hair fell freely over her shoulders, and her eyes sparkled softly in the candlelight. "You felt it," she said, without needing to explain. Taisto inclined his head. She approached. Helmi hadn't asked what exactly. There was no need. She perceived the changes differently. If Taisto listened to the earth, Helmi watched the horizon. She approached the window and placed her palm on the cold glass, not yet changed by the breath of the storm. But beyond it, in the distance, something disturbed the silence. First it seemed only an illusion, a tiny flicker, almost mistaken for a shooting star. But the light didn't disappear. It moved, it trembled, it would hide behind the curve of the waves, then reappear. Helmi narrowed her eyes. "It's not lightning," she murmured. Taisto opened his eyes. No, the light multiplied. 0.1 became 2.2 became 3. Hot spots in a cold universe. Helmi felt a change in the air. Not just the pressure of the storm, but something else, a presence, a wind-blown smell, foreign wood, wet cloth, burnt oil. Something was coming towards the island. Above the forest, the leaves were beginning to tremble, although the breeze was still weak. The animals felt it too. The deer gathered deeper into the thicket. The night birds changed their flight direction. Even the lakes in the interior of the island seemed darker, as if their surface had deepened. Eero went out into the corridor, drawn by the tension floating through the walls. Her brothers had already appeared. Eero stood straight, his jaw set. Lori watched curiously, almost intrigued. Mikko had a slight smile, as if he anticipated the fun. Sammy, the youngest, was restless. "What is it?" Eero asked. "The storm," Eero answered shortly. But Eero knew it was not just that. They went down together into the great hall. Helmi was still looking out to sea. Taisto had remained still, but the air around him seemed thicker. A barely perceptible sound reached them. T was not thunder. Not Y-E-T-T was something rhythmic. Metallic. Wood hitting water. Mikko was the first to understand. "It is not just the storm," he said quietly. Helmi pointed to the horizon. The lights had become clearer. Now they could be seen like lanterns swaying with movement. Between them a dark, massive shadow was forming. Ship. Taisto stepped forward. For the first time in many generations, something foreign was approaching Verenkai. "The sea brings them," he said. It wasn't a question, T was a statement. The wind suddenly changed direction, like a beast turning its head. The clouds, until then invisible, began to gather from the west, thick and heavy. The stars disappeared one by one, swallowed by the darkness. The storm was coming. The waves rose higher, hitting the rocks with increasing force. The foam rose into the air, and the sound of the water became louder. The ships would creak in the distance, carried by the wind to the palace. Windows. Eero put her hand to her chest. She felt a beat. Not her own heart, for the vampire's heart was quiet, but the vibration of other hearts, far away, on the water. Faint, but numerous. Life. For a moment, the silence between the family members became tense. There was a different smell, almost impossible to distinguish yet, but present in breeze. Human blood. Eero tensed his shoulders. Mikko moistened his lips instinctively, then suppressed the gesture. Sami took a step back. Taisto raised his hand. No words were needed. Family discipline was stronger than instinct. Helmi continued to watch the lights that swayed chaotically. Now it was clear. The storm was no accident. The wind was pushing the ship directly towards the sharp shores of the island. "I don't know these waters," she whispered. The waves crashed against the rocks again, more violently. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating for a split second the complete silhouette of the ship. The tall masts, the flapping sails, people moving in panic on the deck. Eero took a deep breath. It was the first time she had seen human beings, oh fragile, so alive. The thunder erupted late, shaking the air. The palace windows vibrated. The candles flickered, but did not go out. "They will crash against the rocks," Lori said, in a voice in which the irony had disappeared. Taisto did not answer immediately. He watched the scene with a calm, almost solemn intensity. "The island did not call them," he said. "But it does not reject them either." Helmi turned her head towards him. "What will we do?" It was a hard question, one that had not been asked for generations. The storm erupted in full force. The rain began to fall in slanting gusts, whipping the rocks and the forest. The wind howled between the palace towers, making the ivy stir like green snakes. Offshore, a sail towed, mast tilted dangerously. Faint cries reached the shore, carried by the storm. Eero felt a strange pain in her chest. It was not hunger. It was fear for someone else. The ship was getting too close. A huge wave lifted it, then threw it sideways. The wood hit the rock with a sharp, heartbreaking sound. Another blow, and another. The light from the lanterns spread chaotically. Helmi closed her eyes for a moment. Taisto straightened her back. "Get ready," he said calmly. "This night will change Verenkai forever." Lightning lit up the sky again, and for a full second the entire island was bathed in a white, almost divine light. Verenkai was no longer breathing quietly. He was breathing deeply, rapidly, as if before a leap into the unknown. The storm had fully broken out over Verenkai Island. The sky, which only an hour before had been dotted with cold stars, was now a compact mass of heavy clouds, split by white lightning. The thunder no longer came in distant echoes, but fell directly over the sea, shaking the water and rocks alike. The waves grew with every moment, rising like moving walls, hitting the shore with primitive force. Offshore, the ship of the noble families of Venice struggled in vain with the fury of the sea. The vessel had been built for elegance and long voyages, not for it was braving the rough waters of northern Finland. Its tall masts, carved with fine detail, tilted menacingly under the pressure of the wind. The sails, once white and proud, were now torn, struggling like the wings of a wounded bird on deck. People were running in panic. Alessandro Conti clung to the wet railing, trying to keep his balance. The water lashed at his feet, and the wind snatched his cries away before they could reach the others. Beside him, Matteo Foscari tried to help a fallen sailor, while Lorenzo Belladonna shouted desperate orders. Although no one had control of the ship anymore on the opposite side of the deck, Isabella Rossi clutched her younger sister's hand, and Bianca Monteluce tried to calm Serafina Belladonna, who was trembling uncontrollably. Lucia Foscari watched the approaching shore with a clarity terrifying. Black rocks, sharp, ruthless, a bolt of lightning split the sky and lit up the scene for a terrifying moment. The island of Verenkai rose from the sea like a living fortress, with steep walls and dense forests, and above them, on the highest cliff, the silhouette of the palace Kartano Varjoveri was outlined. For a second, it seemed that the towers were watching. Then darkness fell again, and the palace, the Varjotar family, watched. Taisto stood on the top of the cliff, motionless in the rain. The drops slid down his face without disturbing his expression. Beside him, Eero and Mikko followed the ship's every movement. Lori analyzed the trajectory of the waves with cold eyes. Sammy was restless, and Aino felt in the air the beating of hearts on the so many fast. The ship was lifted by a huge wave and thrown sideways. The wood hit the cliff with a deafening sound, a deep crack, like a broken bone. Another wave came. Immediately, crashing the ship on the opposite side. The structure began to give way. "Now," Taisto murmured. The mainmast broke, falling over the deck. The screams of the people mingled with the roar of the storm. A side of the ship split open, and water rushed in violently. Alessandro fell, hitting the slippery floor. Matteo pulled him to his feet. Lorenzo tried to reach their sisters, but the deck tilted suddenly, and they were all thrown overboard. A final flash of lightning illuminated the scene just as the ship crashed head-on into the rocks hidden under the water. The sound was final. The wood gave way completely. The ship broke in two. The cold water swallowed them mercilessly. For people, the North Sea was a brutal shock. The cold took their breath away, and the waves pulled them down with merciless force. Torn sails, planks, ropes, and barrels floated chaotically among them. Alessandro managed to grab a piece of wood and to cling to her. Matteo had disappeared for a moment under the water, then reappeared, coughing and struggling with the waves. Lorenzo was calling out the girls' names, but the words were lost in the storm. Bianca was struggling, trying to keep her head above water. Lucia was clinging to a floating rope. Isabella and Serafina had been separated by the waves and the rocks. The vampires were watching. Eero took a step forward, instinct sharpening his features. "They will die," he said coldly. Taisto stopped him with a simple wave of his hand. Not yet. Eero could no longer bear to watch passively. She felt the people's panic like a vibration in the air. Every heartbeat was a spark. Every desperate breath was a call. "Father," she whispered. Taisto looked at her for a long time. There was no hunger in her eyes. There was compassion. The storm was still raging, but the waves were beginning to push the remains of the ship toward a lower part of the shore, where the rocks gave way to a narrow strip of beach. "Now," he said, in an instant, the Varjotar family descended from the cliff. They moved quickly, almost invisible in the rain. Their feet touched the ground without a sound, and the wind seemed to move out of their way. The first to reach the water was Mikko, entered the waves without hesitation. Swimming with unnatural speed, he grabbed Bianca's arm just as she was about to lose her strength. She felt a cold but firm hand, and for a moment she thought it was an angel or a sea demon. Lori found Lorenzo and pulled him to shore. Eero lifted Matteo from the water with a strength that would have seemed impossible to a human. Sammy found Serafina, almost unconscious, and carried her to the sand in his arms. Eero was looking for Alessandro. He saw him hanging on to a plank, exhausted. The water was constantly hitting him, and his hands were shaking. They were sliding. She entered the sea without fear. The cold did not affect her. The waves were hitting her, but they did not shake her. When she reached him, his eyes were half closed. For a moment, their gazes met. He saw a pale figure, with wet hair stuck to her face, with unusually clear eyes. He did not understand what he was seeing, did not understand how he had gotten there. Then Eero took his hand. Her grip was cold, but incredibly strong. She pulled him through the water with an ease that defied logic, keeping him away from the rocks and the sharp remains of the ship. In a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, all the survivors reached the beach. The storm was beginning to lose its fury, like a tired beast. The rain was thinning, and the thunder was gradually receding on the wet sand. The Italians lay exhausted, trembling, breathing heavily. Their elegant clothes were destroyed. Their hair was stuck to their foreheads. Their gazes were full of shock. Around them, in a semicircle, stood the Varjotar family, silent, motionless, wet from the rain, but perfectly composed. For the first time in generations, two worlds looked at each other face to face. Alessandro managed to rise to his knees. He wiped the water from his eyes and looked at them. Their silhouettes were illuminated by the last distant lightning. They seemed human, and yet not. Eero stood a little in front. Her wet dress clung to her silhouette, and her hair fell in dark waves. Her eyes looked at him with a quiet intensity. No one spoke. There was no common language. There was no explanation. Only the heavy breathing of the survivors and the almost supernatural silence of the island that had welcomed them. Behind them, the remains of the ship were still crashing against the rocks, the last pieces being swallowed by sea. The ship had been broken, but their lives had not, and Verenkai, which until then had been a closed universe, had become that night the scene of an impossible encounter. The storm had moved away to the open sea, leaving behind a still restless sea and a shore strewn with scraps of wood, wet ropes and deep tracks in the sand. The sky was beginning to clear, and a pale moonlight was filtering through the broken clouds. Verenkai Island seemed to be breathing again, but the air remained charged with something new, an invisible thread that connected two worlds. On the wet beach, the survivors of the shipwreck lay exhausted. Some sat on the sand, others knelt, leaning on each other. Their clothes, once fine and carefully tailored in the workshops of Venice, were now torn and heavy with salt water. Their faces bore the imprint of fear, cold, and an incomprehensible reality. Around the Varjotar family sat in silence. Tea was not a threatening silence, but not a soothing one either. Tea was a deep, almost solemn silence, like that before a revelation. Eero stood a little in front of her brothers. Her light-colored dress, now soaked with water, clung to her figure, and her hair fell in heavy strands over her shoulders. Her eyes, a grayish blue, looked at the group of people with an intensity that even she did not fully understand. She felt them, a vampire. The world was defined by invisible rhythms, the movement of blood through the veins, the vibration of footsteps on the ground, the throb of a heart in panic. That night, the beach was full of such rhythms. They were rapid, disordered, charged with fear. But one of them stood out. Stronger, clearer. Eero turned her gaze and saw. Alessandro Conti slowly rose from the sand, leaning on one elbow. He was breathing heavily, and his chest was rising and falling visibly under his wet shirt. His black hair was stuck to his forehead, and a fine cut colored his temple with a thin trace of blood, already diluted by the rain. For a moment, his brown eyes, still cloudy with shock, lifted and met hers. Time did not stop, but it seemed to deepen. Eero could no longer hear the waves. She no longer felt the presence of her brothers. She only felt the rhythm of his heart. It was beating fast, erratically, still under the influence of fear. But behind the panic there was something warm, vibrant, alive in a way she had never known so closely. His heart was beating for life. Alessandro blinked, trying to clear his vision, and in front of him stood a silhouette that didn't seem real. The girl's skin was too pale for that cold, her features too delicate for a simple apparition from an unknown island. Her eyes did not reflect the fear she saw in the others. She looked at him as if she were studying him, as if she were trying to understand him. Around them, the other members of the Varjotar family remained motionless. Taisto observed the scene with an impassive but attentive expression. Helmi looked alternately between Eero and the young Italian, sensing the subtle vibration that had arisen. Eero was rigid, his jaw clenched. Him, people were strangers and, implicitly, a danger. Mikko had a curious glint in his eyes. Lori analyzed the reactions with intellectual coolness. Sammy seemed uneasy but not hostile. But between Eero and Alessandro a special space had formed, an invisible circle that isolated them from the rest of the world. Alessandro tried to stand up completely, but his knees trembled. She took a step forward, instinctively. Her movement was so fluid that it seemed as if floating above the sand. He froze. He didn't know what they were. He didn't know if they were rescuers or something else. But he knew he no longer had the strength to run. Eero stopped a few steps away from him. He could feel the heat of her body, the difference in their natures almost painful. Vampires were cold, controlled, calm. He was fire and breath and fragility. His gaze dropped for a moment to her hands. Her fingers were fine, pale, without a trace of trembling. When he raised his eyes again, he saw in hers something that did not fit the image of a threatening being. Curiosity and amazement. For Eero, Alessandro was not just a man, he was the first man. The first to stand in front of her, so close that she could hear his breathing without focusing her senses. She reached out, very slowly, not to catch him, not to control him, just to touch him. Alessandro hesitated for a split second. Behind him, Lorenzo was muttering something in Italian, probably a warning. But the sound faded. He raised his own hand. When their fingers touched, the difference between them became clear. Her skin was cold, but not unpleasant. It was a stable, soothing cold, like stone touched on a summer night. His skin was warm, alive, pulsing beneath the surface. Eero felt that pulse through the simple contact. An unknown shiver ran through her body. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't bloodlust. It was something else, a vibration that didn't come from instinct, but from a deeper place. Alessandro realized that she wasn't holding him tightly. It wasn't a predatory grip. She was almost shy. Around her, the other people watched the scene with disbelief. Bianca put her hand to her mouth. Isabella held her breath. Lucia watched carefully, memorizing every detail. Eero slowly withdrew her hand, but her gaze did not leave it. For her, the world had suddenly opened up. All the vague stories about beings outside the island had become reality, embodied in the eyes of that young man who looked at her. With a combination of fear and fascination, Alessandro felt his heart beating faster, not just because of the cold or the danger, but because, inexplicably, he did not want to break that eye contact. In the distance, a stronger wave hit the shore, bringing the sound of the sea back into everyone's consciousness. The world was moving again. Taisto took a step forward. His presence imposed the reality of the situation again. They were two different groups, separated by language, culture, and nature. But the moment had already happened. Eero took a step back, returning to her family. Alessandro remained standing, still trembling slightly, but straight between. No words had been spoken to her, and yet, in that first glance, more had been said than any language could express. Verenkai Island, which until then had known only the echo of its own shadows, had witnessed a spark. It was not yet love. It was not trust. It was not a promise. It was the beginning of a question. And that night, under the slowly clearing sky, Eero understood one thing. The storm had not only brought shipwreck. It had brought a change that neither the sea nor time could erase. Night had descended again over Verenkai Island, but it was not the same night. The storm had dissipated out to sea, leaving behind a wet shore, salty air, and a silence laden with questions. The sky was cleared of clouds, and the moon, almost full, illuminated the beach with a pale, silver glow. The remains of the ship were scattered along the sand, like the bones of a creature giants knocked down by the sea. The survivors from Venice stood grouped together, shivering. Their wet clothes clung to their skin, and the northern cold, unlike the gentle breezes of the Venetian lagoon, penetrated their bones mercilessly. Their breaths were visible in the cold air in front of them. The Varjotar family kept a careful distance. Not hostile, but not close. Either, Taisto observed. Helmi analyzed expressions and gestures. Eero remained alert. Mikko and Lori studied with restrained curiosity. But Sammy, the youngest of the brothers, looked differently. He did not focus on the differences. He focused on the trembling of hands, on the way a girl rubbed her arms to keep warm, on the blue lips of a boy trying to appear strong to the others. Sammy took a step forward. Eero gave him a sharp look, but Taisto did not intervene. His father's gaze was calm, attentive. He let things unfold. Sammy turned his head towards the forest at the edge of the beach. Wood was in abundance, branches broken by the storm, pieces of trunk brought by the sea. For vampires, fire was not a necessity. They did not feel the cold like humans. They did not need heat, but humans did. Sammy moved quickly, almost invisible to the untrained eye. In a few moments he gathered arms of dry wood, thin branches and thicker pieces of trunk. He placed them on the sand, at a safe distance from the wet remains. The Italians were looking at him suspiciously. Lorenzo Belladonna whispered something in Italian, probably a warning. Bianca Monteluce kept her arms crossed, trying to stop her trembling. Alessandro was watching. Sammy with intense concentration, trying to understand his intention. Sammy stopped. He stood by the pile of wood and turned to them. He raised his hands slowly, showing his bare palms, simple gesture, not attack. Then he knelt. With a precise movement, he took 2 sharp stones from his coat pocket. They were pieces of flint that he sometimes carried for rare situations. Striking them carefully, sparks jumped across the dry wood. The first attempts were weak, murmured spark. A timid flame that quickly died out. Sammy did not hurry. He repeated the movement, concentrated. Finally, a stronger spark caught in a piece of dry bark. A thin thread of smoke rose. Sammy blew gently. The flame appeared. Small at first. Fragile, but alive. For the first time, something other than fear was reflected on the Italians' faces. Hope. Sammy added thin twigs, then larger pieces. The fire grew, casting long shadows on the sand and illuminating the faces of the 2 groups. The heat began to spread, timid but real. Bianca was the first to take a step forward. She stopped at the edge of the circle of light, looking at the fire as if it were a miracle. She stretched her hands over the flames. The warmth enveloped her fingers. Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of relief. Lucia and Isabella also approached, imitating the gesture. Alessandro stood back a little, looking at Sammy. Sammy raised his hands again, then brought his palm to his chest. Me. Then he pointed to the fire. For you. The gestures were simple, but the intention was clear. Alessandro understood. He brought his hand to his chest. Then he bowed his head slightly, a sign of gratitude. Sammy didn't know the words, but he bowed his head in turn. The first exchange. The first deck and the back, eye.No. Watched the scene with a new emotion. The fire lit up the people's features in a different way. It made their skin look golden, their eyes shine. Alessandro, in particular, had his face shaped by shadows and light, and his expression gradually changed from suspicion to recognition. The fire crackled, and sparks rose into the cold air. Mikko approached and threw another piece of wood into the flames. His movement was more relaxed, almost playfully. Bianca looked at him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no longer just fear in her gaze. There was curiosity. Laurie, a careful observer, bent down and drew a simple symbol in the sand with a stick, a circle. Then he pointed to the fire. The circle was drawn around the flames. Safety. Lucia looked at him and understood his intention. He took another stick and drew another symbol next to the circle, a wavy line. Water. Then he pointed to the sea. Laurie smiled discreetly. Language was beginning to be born. Taisto and Helmi watched the scene with deep attention. The fire was not just a means of heating. It was a symbol. For humans, fire meant life, protection, community. For vampires, fire had always been a neutral element. Useful, but distant. Now it was becoming something different, a boundary. The circle of light created a space between the 2 worlds. The humans stood close to the flames, the vampires a little further back, where the shadows were thicker. And yet, no one left. Sammy sat down on the sand, at a respectful distance from Alessandro. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the flames. Alessandro did the same, imitating the posture. For a few minutes, There were no gestures, just the fire burning and the sea murmuring in the background. Then Alessandro took a small object from his pocket, a piece of metal with an engraved symbol, a Venetian medallion, probably. He held it up and showed it to Sammy. Sammy looked at it carefully, then gently touched his own chest, where under his coat he wore an old Varjotar family talisman, a black stone carved with a ancient sign. He didn't take it out, but he tapped it lightly with his fingers. "I have it, mine." Alessandro understood. The fire crackled louder, and the sparks rose to the starry sky. That night, on the beach of Verenkai Island, no common words were spoken. There were no translations, but there were glances, gestures, symbols drawn in the sand, and a fire that united two separate groups of nature, language, and history. Eno looked at Alessandro across the flames. The light danced in his eyes. His heart still beat hard, but no longer from fear. The fire between the worlds burned, and in its light, the distance between vampires and humans seemed, for the first time, smaller. Chapter 2. The Palace of Shadows. Morning brought no warm light to the island of Verenkai, but a cold pearly clarity that made every detail seem sharper. The sea still murmured after the storm, and the remains of the ship were scattered along the shore like a painful memory. The fire that had been lit the night before had gradually died down, leaving behind smoking ash and a dark circle on the sand, the place where two worlds had taken their first step towards each other. Taisto Varjotar looked at the group of survivors and then raised his hand slightly, making a calm but firm gesture. "Come." There was no common language, but the direction was clear. The Italians looked at each other. Alessandro took the first step, still hesitant, but determined not to show fear in front of his family. Lorenzo and Matteo followed him. The girls huddled together, stepping carefully on the still wet sand. The Varjotar family turned towards the path that led to the up, towards the cliff on which the palace Kartano Varjoveri stood. The road was not easy. T climbed steeply, winding through tall pines and moss-covered rocks. The air smelled of resin and wet earth. The forest was silent, not a natural silence, but a careful one, as if the island itself were watching every step. Bianca tightened her wet cloak around her shoulders. "Dove siamo," she murmured, almost to herself. Lucia looked up and saw through the branches the first outlines of the palace. Tall, pointed towers, a gray almost black, rose above the trees. The windows were long and narrow, like vertical eyes. Ivy climbed the walls, and stone sculptures of wolves and nocturnal creatures guarded the corners of the building. Alessandro felt a shiver run down his spine. T was not just a castle, T was a fortress, relic of an era he knew only from the old legends of Europe. When they reached the main gate, the Italians stopped instinctively. The doors were massive, made of dark wood, reinforced with thick bands of iron. Unknown symbols were engraved on their surface, curved lines and a central circle pierced by a sharp shape. Helmi took a step forward and pushed the doors open. They had not made a sound. The interior of the palace, she swallowed them. The air inside was colder than outside, but not humid. A tea was dry and lightly perfumed with the smell of melted wax and old stone. The main hall was vast, with a vaulted ceiling, supported by carved columns. Light filtered through tall stained glass windows, colored in tones of dark red and deep blue, casting long shadows on the stone floor. The Italian's footsteps sounded differently, more pressed. more hurried. The vampires walked noiselessly. Isabella put her hand to her mouth. Looking up on the ceiling were old paintings, depicting night skies and silhouettes that seemed to float among the stars. They were grandiose, almost mythological scenes. "It looks like a cathedral," she whispered, and indeed, the palace had something sacred about its Gothic architecture. The high arches, the stained glass, the imposing symmetry, all inspired solemnity. But it was not a place of prayer, tea was a place of shadow. The great hall opened before them, dominated by a long table of dark oak. Above it hung a heavy, wrought-iron chandelier in which thick candles burned. Their flames were steady, as if the air dared not disturb them. Alessandro stepped deeper into the room, slowly rotating to absorb every detail. On the walls hung ancient tapestries, woven in dark shades, depicting forests, wolves, and stylized human figures. Felt again that strange combination of fear and fascination. This place had not been built for people. Lorenzo approached a high window and looked out to sea. From there, the shore seemed small, and the remains of the ship was barely visible. She realized how isolated they were. Sammy brought some thick blankets, placing them on the backs of chairs. She showed them with simple gestures that they could use them. Bianca hesitated, then took one and wrapped it around her shoulders. Helmi motioned for them to sit. Tea was not an order, but an invitation. The Italians sat at the end of the table, close together. The vampires remained standing or moved slowly around the room, like conscious shadows. The silence became oppressive. Not for vampires, they were used to it. But for humans, this silence had weight. Lucia dared to get up and approach a wall where a tall bookcase stood. The books had dark leather covers, some with gold symbols on the spines. She reached out and touched one, but did not remove it. Laurie noticed gesture. He approached and, with a fluid movement, extracted an old volume, opened it and placed it on the table, showing the illustrated pages. Drawings, old maps, constellations, symbols. Lucia leaned over them, fascinated. Although she did not understand the language, she recognized the shapes of the sky. The first intellectual bridge. In a corner of the room, a massive fireplace dominated the wall. Miko lit the fire without haste. The flames rose, and their light added another layer of moving shadows on the walls. Bianca watched the dance of the fire reflected in the stained glass windows. The red and blue colors mixed, creating the impression that the walls were breathing. Alessandro slowly got up and approached of a carved column. On its surface was represented a wolf with its head raised towards the moon. The details were so fine that it almost seemed alive. He turned his head and saw Eero. She stood by one of the windows, the light filtering through the stained glass, coloring her skin a reddish hue. Her eyes followed him. Not threatening, not cold. Curious. Oh, Alessandro, the palace was frightening in its grandeur, but her presence brought a strange balance, as if there was an invisible point of warmth between the cold walls. While the others timidly explored the space, Taisto walked slowly through the hall, observing the people's reactions. He looked for excessive fear, he looked for hostility, he found only amazement. Helmi stopped next to Isabella and, with a delicate gesture, showed her a carved bench where she could rest. Isabella sat down, still attentive, but less tense. The solemn silence of the palace was beginning to take on another hue. Tea was no longer just the silence of shadows, tea was the silence of expectation. People had never been within these walls, and the walls, if they could speak, would confess that they had not felt such different presences for centuries. Alessandro turned to the others and made a broad gesture with his hand, indicating the hall. "Incredible," he murmured. Aino didn't understand the word, but she understood the tone. The Palace of Shadows was no longer just the fortress of an isolated family. That morning, it had become the scene of an impossible encounter, a place where fear and fascination coexisted, where the severe Gothic met the southern elegance, where solemn silence no longer separated, but began to unite. And somewhere, deep within the cold walls, the echo of human footsteps remained as a promise that Verenkai would never again be just an island of shadows. The Kartano Varjoveri palace had never been a place of hesitation. Its thick walls preserved the memory of generations of vampires who had lived in isolation, in order and discipline. Every column, every stained glass window, every shadow had a well-established meaning. The entry of people had disturbed this balance, and the one who felt the rupture most acutely was Eero Varjotar. He stood near one of the arches. The firelight from the fireplace only partially touched his face, drawing hard lines on his tense jaw. His eyes, a cold blue, did not leave the group of Italians. For him, every heartbeat in the room was a challenge. The sound was constant, warm, insistent. Unlike the controlled silence of his family, the people vibrated with life. Tea was a disorderly rhythm, sometimes accelerated by fear, sometimes slowed by fatigue. For Eero, that sound was not just a biological difference. It was a dangerous call. He crossed his arms over his chest. "He shouldn't be here," he said in the old family language, quietly enough so that only his own could hear him. Mikko turned his head, leaning against a column. "They are shipwrecked," he replied calmly. "Not invaders." "The difference is fragile," Eero replied. Lori, who was leafing through one of the books brought to the table for Lucia, raised an eyebrow. "Fragile doesn't mean dangerous." Eero didn't answer. To him, fragility was exactly what made the situation dangerous. People were vulnerable. Vulnerability appealed to instinct, and instinct, if left unchecked, could destroy everything their family had protected for centuries. His gaze slid to Isabella Rossi. She stood near the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her brown hair, still slightly damp, fell over her shoulders, and her hands were clasped in her lap. Her eyes moved constantly, analyzing every detail of the room, the vaulted ceiling, the stained glass windows, the long shadows. When she caught Eero watching her, she froze. There was something in his eyes that made her shiver harder than the cold. It wasn't just severity, it was an unwavering intensity, as if he were weighing her, measuring her worth or risk. Isabella lowered her gaze, but she felt that he was still watching her. Alessandro noticed a reaction. He stood up slightly and moved closer to her, without sudden gestures. It was a protective reflex. Eero saw the movement. For a moment, a thought crossed his mind. It would be so simple. Point 1, step. Point 1, quick move. Point 1. Decision. The silence would return. The island would be theirs alone again. But he did nothing. Instead, he broke away from the shadows and stepped into the light. His footsteps were silent, but his presence was impossible to ignore. People sensed the change before they saw him approaching. The whispered conversation stopped. Isabella looked up again, forced by an involuntary attraction. Eero stopped a few steps from her. He was taller than Alessandro, more rigid in his posture. His face seemed carved from stone, devoid of hesitation. His eyes stared straight at her, without detour. Isabella swallowed hard. In her mind, Images from her childhood, stories of creatures of the night, of isolated castles and immortal beings, they were blending with the reality in front of her. She told herself that they were people, or almost people, that they had saved them. But Eero's gaze was not that of a savior, it was that of a guardian. He put his hand to his chest, then pointed towards the great doors of the palace, a clear gesture, "Go away." Isabella understood without translation. Her eyes widened, and her breathing quickened. Alessandro intervened immediately, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Non vogliamo fare del male," he said firmly, although he knew he would not be understood. Eero looked at him briefly, then returned to Isabella. Why her? Maybe because she was the one who betrayed her fear the most clearly. Maybe because her trembling irritated him, or maybe because in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own anxiety. Isabella slowly stood up, although her knees were shaking. She didn't want to seem weak. She didn't want to confirm his assumptions. Eero took a step closer. The difference in temperature between them was perceptible. She felt the cold emanating from him, like a winter breeze. He felt the heat of her body, the rapid beating of her heart. For a moment, those beats destabilized him. They were so vivid, insistent, he clenched his fists to maintain control. "Eero," Helmi said from behind, her voice calm but firm. He didn't immediately turn his gaze. But his mother's call was enough to remind him of discipline. Taisto also stepped into the light. His gaze shifted from his son to Isabella, then to Alessandro. There was no reproach in his eyes, but analysis. Eero lowered his hand slowly. Isabella exhaled, barely aware that she had been holding her breath. Those few seconds had seemed like an eternity. Not because she was afraid of being attacked, although the thought had been there, but because in Eero's eyes she had seen a fight that had nothing to do with her alone. He was afraid, not of the people themselves, but of what their presence could change. Eero took a step back, returning to the shadows, but the tension had not disappeared. A tea hung in the air, thick. Eero, who had been watching the scene by the window, understood more than she had said. Her brother didn't hate people, he hated uncertainty. The island had always been a place of control. The appearance of the Italians was a crack in that control. Isabella sat down again, trying to calm her. Breathing. Alessandro touched his arm lightly, a gesture of support. Eero noticed the gesture again. For a moment, the thought of sending them away returned. It would have been easy to lead them back to shore and let them find their own way, or to make it clear to them that they were not welcome. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fact that his father had not given the order. Maybe it was the fact that his mother did not seem concerned, or maybe it was the fact that, deep down, he knew that the island had already changed. His fear was not just for the safety of his family, it was the fear of the unknown. That day, in the solemn hall of the Shadow Palace, two types of fear had met. The fear of humans for the creatures of the night, and the fear of a vampire for what humans might bring. And between Eero's cold gaze and Isabella's trembling, a new tension was taking shape, one that would not easily disappear, but would shape the future of both worlds. Morning was falling over the palace of Kartano Varjoveri, with a diffuse, pale light that filtered through the tall, stained glass windows. The air was filled with the smell of old stone and damp wood, mixed with the discreet aroma of candles that still flickered in the fireplaces. The sound of the waves hitting the rocks spread through the windows, but inside, the atmosphere was completely different. A solemn, dense, almost tactile silence. It was a silence that weighed on every step and every gesture. Lucia Foscari looked carefully around the large hall. Her large, brown eyes were focused, but not with fear. It was pure curiosity, a mixture of amazement and a desire to understand. Behind her, the Italian noble girls moved timidly, still bearing the marks of the shipwreck. Alessandro and Lorenzo observed the scene, trying to interpret the vampire's reactions without speaking. But for Lucia, words were not enough, and the language barriers complicated any attempt to communication in front of her. Varjotar stood almost motionless. His blue eyes, clear and silent, followed the girl's every move. For Lori, the presence of people in the palace was still a disruptive element. He didn't like change, he didn't like uncertainty. But something in Lucia's gestures attracted attention, and more than that, it aroused a curiosity that hadn't been provoked in a long time. Lucia took a piece of chalk from her backpack and looked for a surface on the floor. The fine sand brought from the beach was still present in some corners, but inside the palace, the cold stone was perfect for a first experiment. With a delicate movement, she drew the first line, a curved line that, for her, meant peace. Lori raised an eyebrow, interested. He brought his hand closer and, with a slow and calculated movement, drew a similar line next to the first. T was the equivalent of a confirmation. Lucia, she smiled slightly, and her eyes sparkled. Despite their differences in nature and language, they had understood the first symbol. T was a start. Encouraged, Lucia began to draw more. Circles that represented fire, wavy lines for the sea, small squares for the houses in Venice that she remembered from childhood. Lori followed each gesture, replicating them or subtly adjusting them to communicate. Each symbol had a clear meaning, each gesture was attentive. Alessandro and the other Italians watched, fascinated. They didn't understand exactly what was happening, but they felt that something special was happening. Bianca and Isabella approached the table and observed carefully, imitating Lucia's gestures. "A language without words," Isabella whispered, trying to understand. Miko, who was standing nearby, noticed the dynamics and raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," he said simply, his gaze sweeping the room. Aino stood aside, almost next to one of the stained glass windows. She did not intervene, but her eyes carefully followed every movement. The girl felt that the language of drawings could be more powerful than any verbal conversation. T was subtle, direct, and left no room for misinterpretation. Lori drew a larger circle and then pointed to the flames in the fireplace. Through repeated gestures, he began to indicate to the Italians that the fire was safe, that they should not be afraid. Bianca understood immediately and stood up, taking a step closer to the flames, while Isabella and Lucia followed suit. Alessandro stayed a little behind, but his eyes remained fixed on the symbols. Each sign drawn in stone or sand was more than a simple drawing. T was a bridge between worlds. The vampires were no longer just observers. Now they interacted with people in a way that did not involve threat or predatory instinct. It was a mind game, a silent but meaningful conversation. Lucia began to draw a series of interconnected lines, representing the path from the sea to the palace, symbolizing safety and the path that people could follow. Lori replied with firmer lines, showing dangerous or hiding places. They were the first clear instructions, a visual language that conveyed essential information without a single word. Behind them, Taisto and Helmi watched the scene carefully. Taisto observed the way the young vampires interacted with people and felt that this was a rare opportunity to test the family's self-control and patience. Helmi, always intuitive, understood that what was happening was much more important than the mere survival. Of the shipwrecked Italians, T was the beginning of a relationship of trust, a small but essential step between two species that had lived apart for generations. Sammy brought more chalk and pieces of wood to expand the surface of the drawings. Each new symbol added was meant to clarify things: food, water, safe places, gestures of kindness. Every detail mattered, and people watched in fascination, trying to memorize everything. Alessandro, brave, took a piece of chalk and drew his own symbol, a heart, simple but strong. Through the gesture, he tried to convey thanks and gratitude. Lori smiled subtly, imitating the symbol, but adapting it to include protection, thus creating a new element of language. Eero observed the scene and felt a strange warmth in his chest. For the first time, he saw how humans and vampires could communicate without words and without conflict. The language of drawings was a bridge between worlds, a chance to build trust. Bianca, inspired by Lucia's gestures, began to draw small lines and circles in the sand by the fire, imitating the symbols used by vampires. Isabella followed her carefully and added her own symbols, forming a kind of visual conversation that went beyond words and linguistic boundaries. As time passed, the language of the drawings developed. The initial simple symbols became more complex combinations, indicating feelings, objects, and directions. Alessandro learned quickly, replicating and adding new gestures. The vampires responded just as quickly, adjusting the symbols to be understood. Miko, Lori, and Sammy began to notice a pattern. People reacted to visual gestures, to symbols, much better than to verbal explanations. Communication thus became fluent, and the solemn silence of the palace turned into a subtle but intense dialogue. In a corner, Eero and Alessandro watched everything carefully. Their eyes met from time to time over the drawing of symbols. Without saying anything, it was a form of communication in which only they seemed to participate, subtle, almost imperceptible. The Palace of Shadows, which had been a place for centuries of silence and discipline, had become the scene of a new language, invented between species. The symbols drawn on stone and sand were more than simple signs. They were the expression of the first understanding, of the first collaboration, of a beginning. Each symbol, each line and circle drawn on the floor or on stones were no longer just drawings. They became the invisible thread that connected the hearts and minds of the two worlds. That day, the language of drawings became more powerful than words, more effective than gestures alone, and deeper than any verbal dialogue. And in the pale light of the morning, in the immense and solemn hall of the Palace of Shadows, all those present understood a truth. Communication did not need common languages when the heart and mind were open. The language of drawings was born. There, in that space of stone and filtered light, relationships began to form. The bridges between humans and vampires had begun, and the first signs of friendship, curiosity, and respect were visible in every drawn line, in every circle, in every symbol that came to life under Lucia and Lori's fingers. The Palace of Shadows was no longer just a vampire sanctuary. That day, it had become a temple of communication and understanding, a place where two worlds met and learned to speak without words. Night had fallen again over the island of Verenkai, leaving behind a dense, oppressive darkness, in which even the moon seemed to shyly hide among the clouds. The Kartano Varjoveri palace, with its Gothic towers and narrow windows, stood like a silent sentinel over the pine forest and steep cliffs. Inside, the Varjotar family was preparing for their ancestral ritual, the night hunt. This was not a simple outing for food. It was a discipline. For vampires, blood was an almost divine impulse, instinctive, but control was essential. After the appearance of humans on the island, the need for caution increased. No one should be hurt, no one should be drawn into their dangerous desires. Taisto Varjotar, the head of the family, was at the head of the group. His imposing silhouette was outlined in the darkness, and his cold blue eyes glinted subtly in the moonlight. Helmi, the mother, followed him elegantly, and the children, eye.No, Sami, Mikko, Lori, and Eero, were aligned according to age and experience. "We must be discreet," Taisto said in a whisper, almost inaudible to human ears, but clear enough for his own. Everyone knew that this was not advice, tea was an order. They stepped out onto the cobblestone path that led from the palace into the forest. The air was cold, damp, heavy with the smell of resin, wet leaves, and salt. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks mingled with the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. For vampires, every sound had an almost tactile intensity. Their senses were heightened beyond normal limits, making every movement of the wind a message, every tremor of the leaves a warning. Mikko and Sami, the youngest, they moved close to eye.No, and Lori remained alert, his eyes fixed ahead, looking for suspicious animal movements. Eero was slightly behind, his gaze cold and watchful, ready to intervene if anything got out of hand. Hunting was not just about satisfying hunger. It was a ritual of self-control. The wind carried the scents of night birds, rabbits, and foxes that scuttled through the low bushes. The vampires adjusted their steps, absorbing every vibration of the ground beneath their light feet. The first sign of prey was a white rabbit, almost invisible in the moonlight. Sami spotted it first. Without making a sound, he made a subtle sign to his brothers. Taisto confirmed, and eye.No bent slightly, preparing to attack. The entire group moved like a united shadow. There were no heavy steps, no noise. Only pure concentration and perfect coordination. In a few seconds, the rabbit was caught, without having had the slightest chance. The vampires retreated a few steps, and eye.No bent over the prey. There was no pleasure in this act, only necessity. The milk of fear and instinct had been replaced by discipline. The animal's blood wasn't just food, it was a symbol of their control. Mikko gathered a few nocturnal birds, and Lori watched every move of a fox that tried to sneak through the dense undergrowth. Eero remained vigilant, sensing every breath, every sound. Even though he hadn't participated directly, his presence was an invisible barrier to any creature that might threaten the group. eye.No smelled the intense scent of animal blood, but she wasn't overcome with desire. Tea was a subtle but crucial difference. An evening like this, their discipline was essential. The temptation to look at people, to feel their blood throbbing, warm and alive, was there, but the hunt focused his mind and deceived his instincts. The moon was rising higher, illuminating the hidden paths in the forest. Taisto decided to head for a small, hidden lake where animals often came to drink. Every step was calculated, every movement carefully controlled. The lake reflected the moon and stars, creating the impression of a silver surface. The vampires sat at the water's edge, making no noise. Their prey appeared quickly. Ducks and a few rabbits approaching the water. Eero and Sami moved simultaneously, and Lori and Mikko followed their movements. The prey was captured efficiently. Nothing was lost. Nothing was wasted. This was their rule: minimum consumption, maximum respect. While they ate, discussions were silent, more gestures and looks. Helmi observed everyone, assessing the level of self-control and how each one reacted to temptation. Taisto remained attentive, his eyes fixed on the figures moving among the trees. This hunt was not just for food, it was a test. For every member of the family, for every emotion, for every pulse. Eero, looking at Alessandro and the other people who were still in the palace, felt a strange combination of protection and restriction. If he were next to them now, he would not be able to control his impulses. By hunting, they ensured that each member of the Varjotar family remained self-possessed, prepared for any situation with humans. As the night wore on, the vampires collected their prey and slowly retreated towards the palace, leaving behind the silence of the forest. Every step was measured, every breath careful. When they arrived back in a great hall, Taisto showed off the gathered prey. The flames of the fireplace illuminated their pale but controlled faces. Each member of the family knew that this discipline defined them more than their strength. Eero sat next to Sami and Mikko, looking at the captured animals. There was no pleasure in her gaze, only the satisfaction of control. Each of them had learned that the temptation of humans, living blood, was more dangerous than any animal, and that discipline was not just a requirement, but a way to survive and protect the vulnerable. Eero stood at the edge of the room, his eyes still steady and watchful. His fear and discipline had turned into a shadow that protected his family. That night, the night hunt was not just about food. It was about self-control, about protection, and about maintaining a balance between instinct and reason. The human and vampire worlds remained separate, but the hunt was a ritual that reminded them that silence, patience, and discipline were their armor against temptation and chaos. And so, under the moon that illuminated the forest and the palace, the Varjotar family returned to the palace, nourished, disciplined, and stronger, prepared for the day ahead, but also for the inevitable challenges brought by the presence of the Italians on their isolated island. The Verenkai night was not over. It was just another chapter in the endless cycle of shadows and discipline, and the vampires knew that the hunt was not just about survival, but about maintaining the balance between their inner hunger and the human world that was now just steps away. Night had fallen again over the Kartano Varjoveri palace, and moonlight filtered through the tall stained glass windows, casting shadows stretched out on the cold stone floor. The atmosphere was charged, as before a storm, and this dense silence. Each step of the Italians echoed differently from the steps of the vampires, who were invisible and echoless in this subtle distance between two worlds. Courage was beginning to make its presence felt, but not in the way anyone would have expected. Bianca Foscari, the noble girl from Venice, felt her heart beating faster than usual. It was a combination of fear, fascination, and an instinctive desire to test the limits. Her brown eyes sparkled in the pale moonlight, and her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the thrill of the challenge. Mikko Varjotar stood nearby, an imposing presence, his arms crossed and his cold blue eyes fixed on Bianca. The young vampire exuded confidence, a native rigidity, but also a tension that had not been felt before the Italians appeared on the island. "Mikko," Bianca said in a whisper, looking at him directly, without verbal fear, but with a subtle hand gesture that indicated curiosity and challenge. Mikko blinked, surprised by her attitude. People were naturally submissive or hesitant in front of vampires, but Bianca was different. She was not afraid to confront them, even if only through gestures. Her entire body sent a clear message, "Don't intimidate me." Bianca took a step closer, but not completely. She kept a respectful distance. She placed her hands on her hips and tilted her head slightly, looking him straight in the eye. Every movement was calculated, deliberate. It wasn't an impulsive gesture, it was a display of pure courage. Mikko raised an eyebrow, unusually intrigued. He didn't like it when someone scrutinized his every detail. He was used to dominating with his presence, intimidating effortlessly. But Bianca challenged him in a different way, without words, without aggressive gestures, just with a calm and direct confrontation of the gaze. Eero, observing the scene from the edge of the room, felt a strange shiver. The tension between the two was tangible in her eyes. Mikko seemed caught between instinct and discipline, between the desire to show her power and the need to respect the family rules. "Bianca is not afraid," Eero whispered to herself, "and that bothers Mikko." Lucia and Isabella watched the scene, fascinated by the silent game between vampire and human. Tea was the first real contact of this kind, a confrontation that did not involve violence, but courage and determination. Bianca reached out her hand towards a carved bench, touching it lightly, as if inviting Mikko to take a step closer. Her sign was not only of challenge, but also of communication. She wanted to show that she was not running away, that she was willing to interact, even if in a tense way. Mikko changed her posture. She lowered her arms slightly and took a step forward, miming accepting the challenge. But his eyes remained attentive, perceiving every fiber of Bianca's body. For him, every movement of hers was information, courage, desire, possible weakness. Bianca did not move. She remained firm, taking a deep breath. She adjusted her position slightly, just enough to show that she wasn't giving in to the intimidation. Her eyes stared straight into his, a silent but elegant challenge. Taisto and Helmi watched the scene from a distance. For Taisto, this was a rare opportunity to assess the family's self-control. If Mikko had given in to his impulse, even for a moment, it would have been a violation of the strict rules. Helmi, intuitive, felt the tension and knew that this was a test not only for Mikko, but for the courage of the Italians. Alessandro watched the scene with a combination of fascination and fear. He didn't fully understand the gestures, but he could feel the energy building between Mikko and Bianca. Tea wasn't a conflict, but neither was it an ordinary interaction. Tea was something deeper, a subtle duel between instinct and courage. Mikko took a step to the side, almost mimicking an attack, but with no intention of hurting. Bianca mimicked the movement, raising her arm in a gesture that might have seemed defensive, but was actually a calculated response, a demonstration of her courage. That moment, the palace hall seemed to contract, as if the entire building felt the tension between them. Eero watched as Mikko began to control his impulses better. Bianca's courage made him careful, disciplined. Wasn't just fear, it wasn't just fascination, it was a tacit respect for her determination. Lucia drew a discreet line in the sand on the floor, a symbol that signified dialogue. Isabella smiled slightly, subtly acknowledging the gesture. Even without words, everyone else perceived that what was happening was a negotiation of energies. Bianca lowered her gaze slightly, then raised it abruptly, establishing eye contact again. Mikko took a deep breath and relaxed his jaw slightly, a sign that the tension had begun to subside. It was small but significant progress. Her courage had forced him to adapt, to adjust his reactions, and to understand that the presence of people on the island was not only a threat, but also a challenge to self-control. Eero felt the entire family absorb the lesson. Bianca's courage had not just been a personal gesture. It had become a catalyst that caused a subtle change in the family dynamic. Mikko was not the only one feeling the impact. Everyone present perceived that their boundaries were being tested, that their traditional world was beginning to intersect with that of humans in a way that required attention, patience, and respect. Bianca took a step back, but maintained eye contact. Mikko, in turn, kept a safe distance, but was no longer intimidating, had established his posture, subtly recognizing that the confrontation had been equal. Alessandro sighed lightly, acknowledging his sister's courage. Lucia and Isabella felt that the first bridge between vampire and human had been strengthened, even if by an almost imperceptible gesture. The silence after the confrontation was not oppressive. It was a silence charged with understanding and respect. Bianca's courage had transformed the tension into an invisible bond, a bridge between worlds, between instinct and reason, between fear and courage. That evening, the Shadow Palace was not only the sanctuary, it was a place where the courage and determination of a single man could influence the dynamics of an immortal family. Bianca had demonstrated that, even in the face of the most powerful presences, courage is not just a gesture, but a force that changes perceptions, shapes behaviors, and creates unexpected bonds. Under the moonlight and the shadows of the stained glass windows, their silent confrontation became a subtle lesson for the entire island. Courage does not necessarily mean the absence of fear, but the ability to face the unknown and intimidating with dignity and precision. And so, in the heart of the Palace of Shadows, Bianca's courage ignited a spark that would burn for a long time, setting the stage for future bonds and conflicts between humans and vampires.On. The Island.Verenkai. Chapter 3. The Frozen Garden. Night had fallen over the island.Verenkai with an almost sacred silence. The sea was calm, and the waves hit the rocks with a gentle rhythm, like a deep and constant breath. Above the palace of Kartano Varjoveri, the northern sky was beginning to come to life. Green and blue streaks were slowly taking shape, undulating like ribbons of light. The northern lights were making their appearance. Varjotar stood on one of the side balconies of the palace, watching the celestial spectacle. For her, the Aurora was not a miracle, but a familiar, almost intimate presence. She had grown up with the lights dancing above the island, and each appearance awakened in her a sense of belonging. It was a sign that the night still belonged to their place. Inside the palace, the Italians looked on in fascination through the high windows. Alessandro Bianchi had been the first to notice the unusual glow in the sky. He had pressed his palm to the window and remained motionless, his breath misting the glass. Eero had noticed him. Without saying anything, she made a discreet sign with her hand, inviting him to follow her. Alessandro hesitated for a moment, then went out into the long corridor, dimly lit by torches. His footsteps were noisier than hers, but he tried to be careful. The massive door at the end of the corridor led to the palace garden, a place rarely shown to strangers. Eero pushed the door open easily. The cold night air penetrated inside, enveloping Alessandro. The coolness touched his cheeks and made his breathing deeper. The garden was covered in a fine layer of frost. Ancient stone sculptures, representing mythical figures, stood among the narrow alleys. The tall trees, stripped of their leaves, seemed laced with frost. The central fountain was stopped, and the frozen water reflected the light of the sky. But what transformed the garden into an almost unreal realm was the aurora. Waves of green and purple light stretched across the sky, reflecting on the frozen surface of the alleys. The shadows of the sculptures danced, elongated and fluid, as if the entire garden breathed with the sky. Alessandro was speechless. For him, accustomed to the warm sky of Venice and the golden sunsets over the lagoon, the spectacle of the north was overwhelming. He looked up, watching the slow movement of the lights. Eero looked at him. There was no fear in his eyes, only pure amazement. He approached him and gently touched a branch covered in frost. The fine crystals sparkled in the auroral light. Then he pointed to the sky, bringing his hand to his heart, a simple but meaningful gesture. Alessandro understood. Beautiful. Important. He smiled and also brought his hand to his chest, then pointed around, as if, "It's incredible." Eero slowly walked down the main path, and Alessandro followed. Their footsteps left discreet marks on the thin layer of ice. The garden had been created generations ago. It was a space of reflection for the Varjotar family. Rare northern plants grew there, adapted to the cold, hardy shrubs. Flowers that bloomed briefly in the summer and then disappeared under the snow, and one corner of the garden was a hand-carved stone bench. Eero stopped there and invited Alessandro to sit down. He did so, still looking at the sky. The aurora was becoming more intense. The trails of light were moving faster, as if the solar wind had picked up speed. The greens were becoming almost phosphorescent, and the edges were turning a deep purple. Eero sat next to him, keeping a small but respectful distance. For a moment, neither of them made a move. They just watched, and that moment, in the silence. The differences between them seemed to fade. He, a mortal man, with his heart beating hot and fast. She, a creature of the night, with an almost eternal silence in her gaze. And yet, under the aurora, there were only two presences contemplating the same sky. Alessandro stretched his hand towards the air, as if he wanted to touch the light. Then he laughed lightly, realizing the impossibility of the gesture. Eero smiled truly openly for the first time in his presence. He raised his hand and drew a wavy line in the air, imitating the movement of the aurora. Then he brought his fingers closer together, as if he were gathering the light and placing it on his heart. Alessandro repeated the gesture. It was a language of wonder. The wind intensified slightly, making the branches crackle discreetly. Alessandro jumped involuntarily at a louder sound, and Eero immediately turned her gaze towards him. There was no danger, only the forest. He made a reassuring sign with his hand. He nodded, ashamed of his instinctive reaction. But at that moment, Eero felt something different. Not superiority, but the desire to protect him. For the first time, the presence of a man in their garden did not seem like a threat, but a sharing. Alessandro took a small medallion from his pocket, the only object left intact after the shipwreck. He opened it and showed her a painted miniature of his family. Then he pointed to the sky, the garden, and herself. The gesture was simple. "Now, here." Eero looked at the image carefully. The faces were warm, smiling, a completely different world from hers. She brought her hand to her chest and then touched the medallion lightly, in a gesture of respect. The northern lights began to slowly fade, the colors becoming paler. The show was nearing its end, but the silence between them remained. In the distance, from an upper balcony, Mikko observed the scene. He did not intervene, he only analyzed. That night, the frozen garden had become more than a place for the Varjotar family. It had become a meeting place between worlds. Eero stood up slowly and invited Alessandro to do the same. Before leaving, she stopped and touched the trunk of an old tree, with an almost ritualistic reverence. Alessandro had imitated the gesture, without fully understanding its meaning, but feeling its importance. When they turned towards the palace, the lights of the aurora had almost completely disappeared, leaving behind a deep, starry sky. Their footsteps echoed softly on the frozen stone. Behind them, the garden remained silent, preserving the memory of the moment. For Eero, that night marked the beginning of a subtle change. For Alessandro, it was proof that the world was vaster and more mysterious than he had ever imagined. Under the northern sky, in the frozen garden of the Shadow Palace, two different hearts had learned to beat in the same rhythm, not through words, not through promises, but through the shared wonder of a dancing sky. Deep within the palace of Kartano Varjoveri there was a place that the Italians had never seen before. Beyond the great hall, beyond the corridors adorned with old tapestries and spiral staircases that seemed to climb endlessly, there was a closed oak door, reinforced with wrought iron. It was not locked. It had never been. But it was rarely opened. It was the library. For the Varjotar family, the library was not just a room with books. It was their memory, the history of the island, the testimony of the generations that had lived and watched under the northern sky. The tall, hand-carved shelves rose almost to the ceiling, and the smell of parchment, dust, and old ink filled the air. That morning, Lauri Varjotar pushed the door open without a sound, moved inside with light, almost reverent steps. For him, the library was his favorite place in the palace. There, the silence was not oppressive, it was alive. Behind him, Lucia Foscari hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. Her eyes immediately widened. She had never seen so many books in one place before. There were libraries in Venice, of course, but this one had something different, something older, more mysterious. Light filtered through narrow windows, filtered by cold-toned stained glass. Dust particles danced in the air, and every movement seemed slowed down. Lauri looked at Lucia and made a broad gesture with his hand, inviting her to explore. She smiled and approached the first shelf, ran his fingers over the spines of the books, reading titles in languages he didn't recognize. Some were written in ancient runes, others in Latin, others in an archaic Nordic language. Lucia took a small piece of paper and a charcoal from her pocket. Her habit of drawing had not disappeared. She quickly drew the symbol for question, then pointed to the shelves. Lauri understood. Was she looking for something in particular? She approached an older shelf, in a less lit corner of the library. There, the books were more damaged, bound in dark leather, with the edges of the pages yellowed. She pulled one of them out carefully. The cover was thick, almost rigid. It had no visible title on the outside, only a discreet engraved symbol, a circle intersected by a vertical line. Lucia approached immediately. Lauri opened the book on a long table in the middle of the room. The page made a soft sound, like ancient breathing. The text was written in a combination of Latin and an old Nordic language. Lucia recognized a few Latin words and her gaze brightened. She pointed to a line and then looked at Lauri, surprised. He tilted his head, encouraging her to continue. Lucia began to read slowly, whispering, "De creaturis noctis." de sanguine, de pactis inter homines et umbras. Her eyes widened. They zoomed in. It was a book about human legends, about creatures of the night, about vampires. Laurie watched her carefully. He didn't seem surprised. For him, the existence of such texts was natural. Over the centuries, people had invented stories, some exaggerated, some almost true. Lucia turned the page. Simple illustrations depicted pale silhouettes, shining eyes, isolated castles on northern islands. Some drawings were grotesquely exaggerated, huge fangs, wings, deformed shadows. Lucia looked up at Laurie and made a broad gesture, imitating one of the illustrations, then pointed at him. T was a clear question. Is this how people see you? Laurie looked at the drawing, then put her hand to her chest and shook her head slightly. No, then she quickly drew a simple symbol on her paper. A human and a vampire figure, almost identical, connected by a line. Lucia smiled broadly. They continued to leaf through. One chapter described an old pact between a clan of Nordic vampires and an isolated fishing village. The text spoke of an understanding, protection in exchange for silence. But the end was torn, the page damaged. Lucia touched the torn edge with her fingers. The history had been lost or hidden. Laurie felt a slight unease. The book was old, perhaps from an era when the island had not been completely isolated. Perhaps there had been previous encounters with people, forgotten or deliberately erased from memory. Lucia drew the symbol for past, then showed the book and then the palace. Question: have you met people before? Laurie remained still for a moment. Then he made an ambiguous gesture with his hand, neither affirmative nor negative. The truth was more complex. In the silence of the library, the discovery of the book became more than a simple reading. It was a bridge between two perspectives. Lucia continued to read passages in Latin, translating them in a whisper to herself. The creatures of the night are not only monsters, but keepers of balance. She stopped. She looked at Laurie. There was no cruelty in his eyes and no desire for dominance. Only a deep silence. Maybe the legends were not just fear. Maybe they were misinterpretations of the unknown. Laurie turned another page and found a different illustration, a vampire standing under the northern lights, looking at a man without hostility. Lucia smiled. It was almost identical to the scene in the garden between Eero and Alessandro. Coincidence? Or repeated destiny? A light noise in the corridor made her look up. But there was no one. The library remained silent. Lucia drew another symbol, two intersecting circles, one for humans, one for vampires. Laurie looked at the drawing. Then, with a slow movement, she drew a line connecting the intersection to a third circle. The future. Lucia stared at it for a long time. The discovery of the old book was not just a revelation about the past. It was a suggestion that history could be rewritten, and the yellowed pages, people had described vampires as either demons or guardians. Neither version was entirely true. The truth lay somewhere in between. Laurie closed the book carefully. He didn't hide it. He left it on the table. The gesture was clear. It was not a forbidden secret. Lucia gathered up her paper with the drawings and placed it next to the book. Her modern symbols stood next to the ancient legends. Two forms of story. Two perspectives. That day, the library had not just been a place of the past. It had become a place of questions. For Lucia, the book was proof that people had always tried to understand what they did not know. For Lori, it was proof that their isolation had not been absolute. As they left the library, the light in the corridor seemed different. It was no longer just cold and solemn. It was charged with possibility. The book of human legends remained on the table, silent, but opened as an invitation, as a warning, or perhaps as a promise that the story between humans and vampires had never been completely written, and that, on the island of Verenkai, a new chapter had just begun to take shape. The palace of Kartano Varjoveri had been built on silence and discipline. Every stone of its thick walls bore the imprint of generations that had learned to survive through control. The center of this order was Taisto Varjotar, father, leader, guardian of balance. In recent days, however, the silence of the palace had taken on a different hue. It was not noisy, it was not chaotic, but it was changed. Taisto observed the young people and the large hall, where the fire burned constantly for the comfort of the Italians. Eero often sat close to Alessandro. They did not speak the same language, but their gazes were clear enough. Lucia spent hours in the library with Lori. Bianca, with her quiet courage, continued to provoke Mikko with subtle gestures. Nothing was explicit, no rule broken, no direct threat. But the closeness grew. Taisto often stood in the upper gallery, looking down without being noticed. From there, he could see everything. The way Eero tilted her head slightly when Alessandro tried to draw symbols. The way Mikko changed his posture when Bianca entered the room. The way Lori, usually withdrawn, stayed longer in Lucia's presence than he normally would. Helmi sensed him uneasy. "Is something worrying you?" she said one evening, as they both looked out at the sea from a high terrace. Taisto did not answer immediately. His eyes followed the horizon. "Not the people themselves," he said finally, "but what they can cause." Helmi understood. Vampires had lived in isolation for generations, not out of hatred for humans, but out of necessity. Their instincts were strong. Emotions, when they arose, could become dangerous. And young people, whether vampires or humans, were driven by emotions. That night, Taisto descended into the great hall without announcing. The Italians and young vampires were gathered around the long table. Lucia had drawn a new set of symbols, and Lori was explaining to him through gestures the difference between the northern seasons. Alessandro watched carefully, and Eero stood close to him, calm. Bianca and Mikko were at the opposite end of the table, in a silent duel of gazes that had become almost habitual. Taisto felt the change in the AI art. It wasn't just curiosity, it was attachment in the making, and attachments brought consequences. He approached the table. The presence he made the conversation stop, not out of fear, but out of respect. His gaze first stopped on Eero. His daughter was disciplined. She always had been. But a new light now appeared in her eyes, one he had never seen before. Alessandro, feeling the tension, straightened his back. He did not understand the words, but he understood the authority. Taisto put his hand to his chest and then pointed at all the young people, then at the palace, then at his heart. His gestures were slow, deliberate. The message was clear: here is safety, but also responsibility. Lucia instinctively translated for the others by drawing a symbol of balance. Taisto looked at her for a long time. The girl had intelligence and courage, but that was precisely what worried him. After the Italians had retired to their rooms, Taisto called his children into the small council chamber. The light was weak. The flames danced on the walls, and the shadows seemed longer than usual. "I notice your closeness to the people," he said directly. No one answered immediately. Mikko was the first to look up. "We can control them," he said calmly. "It's not about control," Taisto replied. Lori remained silent, but his hands were clenched. Eero took a step forward. "They didn't provoke us. They didn't threaten us." "Not yet," Taisto replied. The silence that followed was not one of submission, but of reflection. Taisto wasn't afraid that the Italians would become aggressive. He was afraid that emotions would weaken discipline. "Attachment can cloud judgment," he continued. "We live long. They don't. This difference is not small." His words hung heavy in the air. Eero felt for the first time the true weight of the difference between her and Alessandro. Helmi intervened gently. "Your father does not forbid it, but he asks you to understand the consequences." Taisto nodded. "If the bonds become too strong, there will come a moment of choice, and not all choices can be made without loss." Mikko crossed his arms, but did not contradict. Lori was thinking about the book in the library, about the legends about pacts between humans and vampires. Maybe history had already provided answers, but Eero was thinking about the frozen garden, about the northern lights, about the way Alessandro had looked at the sky with sincere amazement. Was it wrong to share beauty? Taisto noticed the exchange of glances between his children. He was not cruel, he was not rigid without reason. He was protective. He knew how quickly closeness could turn into tragedy. People were aging. Vampires were not. People were fragile. Vampires were strong. Imbalance could hurt both parties. "Don't forget who we are," he said finally. "It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder." When the meeting ended, everyone left in silence. Taisto was left alone in the council chamber. He approached the window and looked out at the dark sea and the distance. The waves crashed against the rocks, repeating the same endless cycle. Change was inevitable, but change had to be managed. In their rooms, the young people reflected on his words. Eero felt a shadow of doubt, but also a new determination. Lori remembered the legends. Mikko, unexpectedly, thought of Bianca's courage. Taisto's suspicion was not unfounded, but the young people's closeness was not superficial either. A subtle fissure was opening between the generations, not one of conflict, but of perspective. Taisto understood the danger. The young people saw the possibility, and in the Palace of Shadows, under the cold northern sky, the balance was beginning to shift. He tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly. The suspicion wasn't just fear. It was anticipation. Taisto knew that on Verenkai Island, nothing remained the same forever. And if the bonds between vampires and humans deepened, then the future of the palace and the Varjotar family would be rewritten. The question was not whether the approach would bring consequences, but how prepared they were to face them. The wind had come down from the north like a harsh breath, bringing with it the smell of snow and salt. Night had settled over Verenkai with a tense silence, as before a cry, near. The beach where the wrecked ship had been left shattered among the rocks. The Italians had set up a makeshift camp for those who still feared the palace walls. Torn sails from the ship had been stretched between pine trunks, and small fires burned with yellow flames, fragile in the wind. Alessandro kept watch by the fire, his hands outstretched for warmth. Around him, his brothers and sisters of the 5 noble families, tired but determined, were trying to find meaning in their new life on the island. Although the vampires had offered them shelter in the old palace, some of the Italians had preferred to stay close to the sea, close to what reminded them of the world. Bianca stood next to Isabella, and Lucia held her sketchbook in her arms, as if it were a weapon against the unknown. The sky was clear, sprinkled with cold stars. Above, the aurora was beginning to move slowly, like a green curtain that vibrated silently. The first howl came from the depths of the forest. T was long, not threatening. Isabella jumped. Bianca immediately stood up. Alessandro instinctively reached for the knife he wore at his belt. Then came the second howl. Closer, and the third. Lucia closed her eyes for a moment. It wasn't a single animal. T was a pack, and in the forest, among the thick shadows of the pines, yellow eyes began to appear, one by one. Silent, calculated. The wolves of the north were larger than those the Italians knew from their legends. Their fur was thick, gray-white, adapted to the cold. Hunger had brought them close. The small fires were not enough. Alessandro took a step forward, trying to seem larger than he was. But the wolves were not afraid of gestures. They sensed weakness, the smell of strangers, fragility. The first attack was swift. A wolf jumped over the circle of fire, fangs bared. The cry of an older nobleman broke the silence. Alessandro raised his knife, but before the blade could touch the air, a shadow moved faster than any human being. It was Eero. He appeared from the trees like a gust of dark wind. He caught the wolf in the air and threw it back into the snow with a force that made the ground tremble. His eyes glowed red in the firelight, not with anger, but with concentration. The same moment, other figures descended from the forest. Mikko landed next to Bianca, pushing back another wolf with a precise movement. Lori positioned himself between Lucia and the rest of the pack, and Sammy moved quickly along the camp circle, making sure no one was left exposed. And the center of the storm, Eno appeared next to Alessandro. Their gazes met for only a split second. He understood. This was not the time for fear. The pack attacked in waves. The wolves were not evil. They were hungry. They were part of the balance of the island. But that night, the balance had been disturbed by the new scent of humans. Taisto arrived last, but his presence changed everything. He sat in front of the camp, straight, calm, imposing. He did not attack immediately. He looked at the pack directly. Leader recognizes another leader, larger wolf, with almost white fur. Broke away from the pack. His eyes fixed on Taisto. For a moment, the night fell silent. It wasn't just a showdown of strength. It was one of territory. The wolf growled. Taisto didn't move. Then, when another wolf tried to sneak up on him from the side, Mikko pushed him away with a quick movement, not seriously injuring him, but enough to make him retreat. The fight continued for several minutes that felt like hours. The vampires moved with controlled precision. They didn't kill needlessly. They pushed. They scared. They redirected. They used their speed and strength to protect, not destroy. Alessandro watched in amazement. Amidst the chaos, the vampires weren't monsters. They were guardians. Wolf got too close to Isabella. She frozen. Before fear turned to tragedy, Eero intervened, placing himself between her and the animal. His gaze was intense, but when he checked to see if the girl was hurt, there was no cruelty in his eyes. Only determination. Finally, the pack leader took a step back. T was enough. One by one, the wolves retreated into the forest, disappearing as silently as they had appeared. The last thing heard was a short howl, not of threat, but of temporary surrender. The night remained suspended. The Italians were breathing heavily. The fires flickered. The snow was furrowed with deep tracks. Taisto turned to the people. He made a simple gesture towards the palace, to safety. Alessandro understood. This time, no one hesitated. The makeshift camp was abandoned. Escorted by the vampires, the Italians climbed the path to Kartano Varjoveri. The palace seemed less scary now. Its massive walls were protection. On the way, Bianca approached Mikko. She said nothing. She only touched his hand for a moment. He did not withdraw it. Lucia walked next to Lori, looking at the wolf tracks in the snow. She quickly drew the symbol of a circle broken and then restored. Eero walked next to Alessandro. He brought his hand to his chest, pointing at her, then at him, then at the palace. Gratitude. Trust. Eero smiled slightly. On the night of the wolves, something had changed. It wasn't just fear that had been defeated. The barrier between them had become thinner, and the great hall of the palace, the fires were lit more brightly. Helmi checked for minor injuries. No one had been seriously hurt. Just scratches. Just. Shivering, Taisto watched the scene in silence. His suspicion remained. But that night, protection had been more important than distance. The wolves had attacked by instinct. The vampires had responded by choice. And the Italians had seen the difference. When silence settled over Verenkai again, the Aurora danced above the palace like a silent promise. The night of the wolves had not been just an attack. It had been an unspoken covenant, and in the face of danger, two worlds had chosen to stand together. After the night of the wolves, the palace of Kartano Varjoveri no longer seemed the same. The walls, the thick walls, which once inspired fear in the Italians, had become shelter. The echo of footsteps in the long corridors was no longer threatening, but familiar. The fires burned more often in the great halls, and the distance between the two worlds had shrunk by an almost imperceptible step. The late morning. Although for vampires the notion of morning was rather symbolic, brought a pale light over the island. The snow reflected the gray sky, and the sea seemed calm, as if the storm of the past days had been just a dream. Eero stood in the frozen garden, her favorite place. The ice sculptures formed naturally from branches and frost crystals transformed the garden into a temple of silence. For her, this place was balance. She still thought about the previous night, the fear in the people's eyes. The way Alessandro had instinctively sat down in front of his sisters, even though he knew he wouldn't have a chance against the pack. His courage had not been reckless, it had been sincere. Light footsteps crackled the snow. Eero didn't turn around immediately. She knew who it was. Alessandro had approached with a concentrated expression, holding something hidden behind his back in his hands. He wasn't as graceful in his movements as the vampires, but he had a lively, warm energy that contrasted with the cold air of the island. He stopped a few steps away from her. Eero turned slowly. He took a deep breath, then pulled out from behind him a small wooden sculpture, an obviously imperfect attempt to recreate the shape of a wolf. The head was too big, the legs slightly crooked, but the eyes had been carefully carved. Eero looked at the object, then at him. Alessandro began to explain with gestures. He pointed to the forest, mimicked a wolf. then made a broad gesture towards her and the other vampires, then placed the sculpture between them. The message was clear. The wolves came. You protected us. Now I'm just wood. eye.No blinked slowly. A glimmer of hope appeared in her eyes. Surprise. Alessandro, feeling that it was not enough, took a step back and began to exaggerate the scene from the night of the attack, imitated a leaping wolf, then exaggerated the way he himself had stumbled in the snow, flapping his arms in a theatrical manner. eye.No remained still for a moment. Then, without warning, her lips curled. First it was just the shadow of a smile, almost imperceptible. Vampires did not laugh often. Their emotions were deep, but rarely explosive. Alessandro continued, doing an exaggerated imitation of the way Miko had thrown a wolf, with a grandiose, almost comical movement. An unexpected sound broke the silence of the garden. A laugh, clear, bright, short, but real. eye.No put her hand to her mouth, surprised by her own sound. Alessandro froze, then smiled broadly, triumphantly, but without arrogance. His eyes were shining. For him, it hadn't just been a joke. It had been a mission to see her smile. eye.No tried to regain her composure, but the corners of her mouth refused to obey. Tea was a new sensation. Not the quiet joy she felt watching the aurora, but a spontaneous ease. She gestured towards the wooden sculpture, then towards him, then touched her heart. Thank you. Alessandro understood. He sat down on a snow-covered bench, shaking it forward in an exaggerated way, eliciting another small laugh from her. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was warm. eye.No looked at the sculpture again. She touched the wood. For her, natural materials had a special energy. The wood had been part of the island. Now it had become a symbol. Alessandro took a small charcoal from his pocket and drew on the snow. He sketched a circle, then two figures inside. Then he drew a wolf outside the circle, cut by a line. Protection. eye.No knelt beside him and completed the drawing. He added another, larger circle around them all. The island. Then he drew a wavy line above them, the aurora. Alessandro looked at the drawing as if it were a work of art. That moment, the difference between them, of language, of nature, of lifespan, seemed distant. On the upper balcony, Taisto watched the scene. He did not intervene. He observed. He had seen his daughter's laughter. It had surprised him. Not because eye.No was incapable of joy, but because that laughter was different. Lighter. More human. Helmi appeared beside him. She laughed, she said softly. Taisto nodded. Yes. There was no anger in his voice. Not even full approval. It was contemplation. And the garden. Alessandro began to tell a story with gestures about Venice, about the waters, the gondolas, the insistent pigeons, mimicked a bird stealing his food, making such a dramatic, indignant expression that eye.No burst into laughter again. Her laughter was not loud, but it was genuine. For the first time since the people had arrived on the island, the joy was not overshadowed by fear or tension. Tea was pure. Miko, passing by, stopped for a moment. He looked at the scene, then raised an eyebrow. One corner of his mouth lifted subtly. He said nothing, but his expression betrayed a new understanding. And the library, Lucia seemed to sense a change in the air. When she came out and saw eye.No smiling, she stood still. Later, she drew a picture in her diary, simple sketch, a heart between two different symbols, and the garden. The silent conversation continued. Alessandro tried to pronounce her name. No, eye.No. The pronunciation was imperfect, but the effort was visible. She repeated it, clearly, slowly. "Ano," he smiled broadly. Then she said, "Alessandro." Her northern accent made the name sound different, but beautiful. For a moment, they just stared at each other. It wasn't just attraction, T was discovery. The first smile hadn't just been a funny moment, it had been a crack in the wall of caution. When the pale sun had gone down and the shadows had lengthened, Ano took the wolf sculpture and placed it on the windowsill of one of the palace's windows, a symbol, not of fear, but of transformation. That evening, at the long table in the great hall, the atmosphere was lighter. Bianca noticed Ano's expression and smiled knowingly. Lucia drew a small smiling face in the corner of her page. Taisto watched the scene. His suspicion hadn't disappeared. But for the first time, he understood that what was growing between them wasn't just danger, it was possibility. And on the island that breathes the night, the first smile had become a beginning.